Welcome to today's Seed World Strategy webinar. My name is Alex Martin, and I serve as an associate editor for Seed World. And today, I'm happy to be your host. Today's theme is covering your bases with cover crops. We will be live tweeting during today's webinar. So if you'd like to join the conversation, please use the hashtag #StrategyWebinar to connect with us. We'd also like to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available at seedworld.com following the proceedings. Presenting the webinar today is Anna Morrow, Midwest Cover Crops Council Program Manager, and Scott Waltman, La Crosse Seed Cover Crop Lead for the Eastern U.S. During the presentation, you'll likely have some questions for our speakers. Please type these into the chat box at any time during the webinar, and we'll address them during the Q&A session we'll hold after both speakers finish their presentations. Well, so we know today we're going to be learning about cover crops, but specifically in today's webinar, you'll learn how the attitudes have shifted towards cover crops over the last 10 to 15 years, what the demand for cover crops looked like in 2019, and how the late planting and flooding have affected these numbers. And finally, what some recommendations are for cover crops within the next year. Our first speaker of the afternoon is Anna Morrow. Anna Morrow has served as the program manager for the Midwest Cover Crops Council for the past 3 years. Anna collaborates with the MCCC Board of Directors, as well as other regional cover crop councils and industry partners to advance the adoption of cover crops by sharing information and tools. She was previously the Agriculture and Natural Resource Purdue Extension Educator in Franklin County, Indiana. She has a master's degree in agronomy from Purdue University with a background in soil and pasture management. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Anna, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here this afternoon. I wanted to start off with just a little bit of background about the Midwest Cover Crops Council. We're a collaboration of university, extension, state and federal agency, industry, and farmers. And we're working to improve cover crop adoption, basically with more cover crop resources, most applicable to the Midwest, and also with some very localized recommendations as well. This is a graph from the 2017 cover crop survey that was put on by Conservation Technology Innovation Center, Sustainable Ag Research and Education, and the American Seed Trade Association. Since they began their cover crop survey in 2012, there's been a steady increase in cover crops, as you can see. Now, these were taken from self-reported from farmers that are mostly using cover crops. But you can see in the latest survey, farmers self-reported about 400 acres each to cover crops in 2016, and they expected to increase their cover crop planting to 451 acres in 2017 at the time of the survey, and that's up from the 217 acres per farm in 2012. So we are seeing an increase in cover crops based on this survey, as well as some more firm data from the USDA Census of Agriculture. In 2012, just over 10 million acres of cover crops were reported. In 2017, that number rose to over 15 million acres, which is roughly a 50% increase in the number of cover crop acres in just about 5 years. So we are seeing increases, and that's not surprising given the cover crop benefits that we see. We've got some short-term benefits as well as some long-term benefits. We're talking about how attitudes have changed surrounding cover crops over the last few years. And we've really seen more of a focus on the long-term soil health type benefits lately. And I really believe this is because those early adopters of cover crop who are maybe more open to risk have realized those short-term benefits and are really pushing for more of the long-term benefits. So we're seeing more press around those soil health and soil function type benefits. But I think it's really important to note that those short-term benefits are still very valuable, even though we might not hear as much about them. Especially with the heavy rainfall events that we've been experiencing, soil erosion and nutrients leaving the field are huge concerns that we can quickly address with some cover crops. So I feel like that's kind of the shift in attitude that we've seen over time, whereas, maybe some of those early adopters are more focused on the long-term game, whereas everyone can benefit very quickly from those short-term erosion mitigation and nutrient scavenging benefits. As far as cover crop management, the Midwest Cover Crops Council likes to see using cover crops as really a change in your management system. So our recommendations for starting a cover crop program are to just start simple and try it on a few acres. Just kind of get your feet wet and see what works for you. We also want to stress that you pay attention to your nutrient and herbicide programs. We encourage no-till or reduced till for best results. It's not absolutely necessary, but it will increase your benefits. And what we like to recommend to beginners is that they terminate cover crops about 2 weeks before they plant, or when cover crops are about 6 to 12 inches and actively growing. Later on in my presentation, you'll see we've got some cover crop recipes for those folks that are new to cover crops and looking to get started. Now, I mentioned what our typical recommendations are for termination. As we know, some springs don't really follow the plan. So we have to kind of change our management strategy in springs like this year. I do want to take a minute to note the difference in the clarity in water in those two different pictures. We've got a tilled field, no cover crop residue. You can see there's quite a bit of soil erosion that's occurring. We're probably losing lots of nutrients in that top photo, whereas in the bottom photo, even though we still have that standing water, that residue is helping to keep that soil in place and nutrients where they're meant to be. So like I said, again, we recommend beginners plan to terminate about 2 weeks prior to planting or when cover crops are 6 to 12 inches and actively growing. We need an actively growing plant to get that herbicide to work. If we don't meet that goal, there are some other options that we've got. The first being to spray 1 to 2 days before planting. The advantage to this is that your herbicide works well on that undamaged plants and the cover crop starts to die before the crop is planted. The risk in this strategy is if it rains and planting is delayed further, that cover crop can start to die and create a dense wet mat that tends to interfere with the planter or drill performance. So that's the risk. Our other option is to terminate cover crops at or just after planting. The advantage to this is that our planter or drill performance is better in that standing cover crop. The risk is that your herbicide might not work quite as well on a damaged cover crop. And if planting is further delayed, we get that, unexpected rainstorm, crops may emerge before cover crop termination, and that's going to limit our herbicide options. The other thing I want to also mention with these, delayed termination of cover crops is to really be mindful of your nitrogen program. Especially for corn, we're going to want to use starter or side dress nitrogen as soon as possible. And not that you need to increase your nitrogen rate, but you will need to kind of front load your nitrogen program. All that residue tends to make the nitrogen in the soil less available. And so just another caution on those springs that we don't have going according to plan. So those are the majority of topics that I wanted to cover, but I did want to show you a few resources if you're looking for more information. This is our Midwest Cover Crops Council homepage. You'll notice we've got states pages. You can click on your state and find some local contacts, some extension publications, lots of good information. We've also got cover crop resources sorted by topic and also by species of cover crop. A new resource that we've just made available are our cover crop recipes. So these are intended to provide a starting point for farmers who are new to growing cover crops. And we recognize that with experience, farmers want to fine-tune some of these and even kind of push the limits a little bit. But these are designed to be a low-risk entry strategy for beginning with cover crops. We're focusing right now on corn and soybean rotation, but we've got more crop rotation recipes in the works. And these are based on your state as well as your cropping rotation. Another interesting resource we have is our cover crop decision tool, and you can find that on our main menu. We are in the process of updating both the recommendations within this tool as well as the user interface, making it a little more user-friendly and mobile-friendly as well. So our cover crop selector tool will take your location information, so your state and your county, and that will pull up a seeding date calendar for you, and that's based on the climate within your own county. From there, you can put in information like your cash crop and your soil drainage information, along as well as different attributes in a cover crop that you're looking for. From there, that will give you, again, like I said, that seeding date calendar and some ratings for some of those cover crop attributes. So you can play around with that and see what species fits within your cropping system and your time frame. Within the cover crop selector tool, we also have information sheets on each cover crop species. So if you simply click on the cover crop species that you're interested in within that list, a full page information sheet will pop up giving you information on planting, like seeding rates, termination, and other advantages with cover crop species. We also have a field guide that is regionally specific for cover crops in the Midwest. And we've also converted that field guide into an app that's available for Apple and Android devices. Beyond that, make sure to check out our website, mccc.msu.edu. We have a listserv where we, toss around cover crop questions. We've got a Facebook page and Twitter, and you're all welcome to join us in our annual meeting and conference in Kansas City, Missouri this February.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Anna, for that wonderful information. I am excited to learn about more tools that we can use to learn about cover crops. Well, on to our next speaker. Our next speaker, if you have a question for Anna, go ahead and type it into the chat box and we'll address it during our Q&A portion of the webinar. But our final speaker of the day is Scott Woltman. Scott is a certified crop advisor and the current agronomist and cover crop lead for La Crosse Seed, headquartered in La Crosse, Wyoming. Or Wisconsin, sorry. Scott also serves as chair for the cover crop working group of the American Seed Trade Association, striving to bring credibility and quality standards and policies to the environmental seed industry, all while representing the trade at both state and federal levels. Scott started his career working for Effingham Equity, an ag retailer in South Central Illinois for 10 years, and later transitioned to Land of Lakes for 7 years, mainly as a forage, alfalfa, cover crop agronomist, working primarily with ag input suppliers and seed dealers across quite a few states. Scott graduated from Southern Illinois University with a bachelor's degree in agribusiness economics, and currently resides outside Effingham, Illinois. And he is married with 2 children. His family there owns a corn, soy, livestock operation. Thanks so much for joining us today, Scott. And go ahead and take it away and give us your information.
Thanks so much. Appreciate the opportunity, Alex, to be on the webinar today. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So we will move on through my slides. I've got a few things to hit on, some of which Anna hit on as well. I'll probably approach this conversation today as one from a seed distributor, seed supplier. Maybe it's a view that you've seen before, maybe it isn't. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but I think after the conversation today, maybe you can have a little bit more of insight into things that the industry talks about as it relates to cover crop numbers and what do we do, where do we go from here. So again, my name is Scott Woltman, and I work for La Crosse Seed. La Crosse Seed is a distributor of cover crops, forages, turf, conservation seeds, and we are headquartered, like Alex said, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. This year, I just want to point out that we are celebrating our 100 years in business, where we take pride in offering our dealers the seed they need when they need it. From a cover crop perspective alone, our customers, I think, recognize and trust our brands and the experience that we have behind them. We do partner, like Alex said, primarily with ag retailers and seed suppliers, and we work really hard at being not only practical, but also keeping agronomics in the forefront. Because if we don't, believe me when I say that our professional retail dealers will kind of call us out on it if we don't, and they're going to let us hear about it if we don't lead with agronomics first. There's a lot of things that I feel like we're gaining more insight on, but trust me, there's a lot of things we have yet to learn. You can see the footprint there. We do have distribution throughout the upper Midwest. Every part of the map there that's covered is areas that we try to serve, and we sell cover crop seed into. This year we sold cover crops, I think, into 28 or 29 states in the country. We do have an experienced team of regional sales managers that are aimed at helping our customers find solutions for their growers. With this map in mind, and the reason I show this map is I'll try to paint kind of maybe a broad, I'll be using a broad brush, but I'm going to try to paint a picture from a seed distributor's point of view. I would contend that any review that I offer from this past year or recommendations that I suggest for the future really come from the experience that our sales team has dealing with a wide range of challenges based on not only the region that we work in and cover, but also the various cropping systems that we work with. And like Anna just shared with you, the data from the 2017 Ag Census shows that cover crops are indeed on the rise, again, up nearly 50% from 2012. Just one point that I would make is that if you look at the 15 million acres and you compare that to other annual row crops or annual crops in general in this country, cover crops are, if you think about it, the fourth largest annual crop. You might want to chew on that for a little bit. No doubt acres continue to follow a favorable trend line, and if they kind of follow that same growth, we're forecasted to be around or even above 40 million acres in 10 years, which again, that number is fairly large. But think about the emphasis it's going to put on not only the seed industry, but the whole channel, growers included, on making sure that we do things right, that we have enough seed, that guys get their seed on time, and guys get the seed that they want. It's my opinion farmers who are using cover crops are using more cover crops, as acres are up more than the number of farms. And I'll add that those that aren't using cover crops might not use them until other factors force a shift in their thinking. If you analyze this new data, you'll find that nearly 60% of the total national cover crop acres come from the Midwest. And I've included on this map are some numbers in the thousands representing some of the leading states, of which many of these actually had over 100% increases from the 2012 survey. The Texas number you see down there, that should be 1,014. So that would be a little over 1 million cover crop acres. I included the number there because that is the largest cover crop state. Of course, there's a large state, a lot of acres to put cover crops in. But you can see the other states there too that I've highlighted. It's important to note that the cover crop acres increase faster in the Midwestern states, about a 75% increase versus about, like Anna said, 50% nationally. Some of those states like Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Nebraska, Ohio, they had over 100% increases, meaning that they doubled in size from the 2012 Ag Survey. But many of you are probably fully aware that an increase in acres doesn't mean that if you take a nice autumn drive in the Corn Belt or in the corn country, that you're going to be in front of cover crop fields left and right. In fact, when compared to other regions in the country, the percent of row crop acres committed to cover crop use in the Midwest is rather minuscule. Compliments of SARE on this map here, which represents cover crop acres as a percentage of corn, soybean, and cotton row crops. Understand cotton, and I'd say as well as corn and soybeans, aren't planted everywhere. Hence, some of the really dark states on the map signifying, they signify upwards of a 30 to 40% coverage. But I think, so maybe that number might be skewed a little bit, but I still think one can recognize that many areas on the East Coast and maybe in the South have a much higher percentage of cover crop utilization. And for us in the seed industry, these numbers are not surprising. We've kind of seen this for some time, and no doubt, again, Anna hit on this, many growers are changing the way they farm by integrating new conservation practices, while others continue to promote the systems they've used on their ground or on their lands for decades. They've been dedicated to sustainable agriculture while not being shy about advancing the message about the long-term benefits of reduced or even zero tillage. Those guys get it. They've been doing it for some time. Adding cover crops for them isn't necessarily a new concept. But for so many others, I'll admit, and everybody in the industry will admit, that there's so much more work that needs to be done to convince them that sustainable farming practices can actually increase one's return on investment. We have work to do. We've made strides, but we still have a little ways to go. All of this is important for several reasons, but I'll say all of this is really important when you consider how the small seed or cover crop industry tries to better realize or forecast what the usage or seed demand will be from year to year, and what regions will need the seed. Understand there's no real national reporting arm within FSA or otherwise that allows our industry to gain insight into not only what cover crops have been planted on farms, but also what intentions will be moving forward. Now, this map that I'm showing you now shows the change in December 1 hay stocks from 2017 to 2018. Notice the red and the white states in particular, where hay inventories at the end of last year were way behind levels from 17 and probably a little bit more realistic or real numbers or normal numbers from 2017. In some states, they faced historical lows in hay reserves. So why is this important? Why do I bring up hay when we're talking about cover crops? Well, just about everything that we use, maybe not everything, I should say, but most everything that we use as a cover crop, the species that we use, in theory, could be utilized as a forage. Many in the industry knew going into this year that livestock producers and hay growers were probably going to be needing seed to recoup their hay supplies. But we could not have forecasted what happened during the winter this past year. So what happened in 2019? This last year brought about many challenges in the seed industry for sure. Again, like I said, none of which we really could have predicted. So last winter of 2019 hit most really hard. According to some in the industry, we actually lost more than 4 million acres of alfalfa to winter kill, not to mention thousands of acres of small grains, and not only that, but perennial grass stands like orchard grass, tall fescue, timothy, ryegrass. We lost a lot of forage. With the flooding that happened after, and then the poor start to the row crop planting season, reality started to set in that this year would present some real challenges in keeping seed supplies available. Prevent plant acres, at least those that were seeded to something, whether we want to call it a cover crop or a forage, anything to maybe reduce fallow syndrome, those acres took away from the cover crop pile of seed as well. If this year, and this is my opinion here, if this year doesn't force seed suppliers, retailers, and growers to plan as best they can, then I'm not sure they'll ever be convinced to. Sure, this year may be an outlier, and I know many in the industry and many in the greater ag industry hopes it's an outlier, no doubt, but realize that weather events and seasonal challenges that may take place in other parts of the country do indeed impact what the forage and cover crop industry can accomplish in a relatively short amount of time. So I'll just add this other chart here, and it might be a little hard to read, and my little red boxes don't exactly line up to the far right there. I would just say don't forget, as we go into 2020, in terms of the need for hay, and thus the need for cover crop seeds that could be planted for forage. I'm talking about small grains, I'm talking about legumes, even brassicas like radish, and just a whole lot of different cover crop species that could be used to feed animals. The demand will be strong for the foreseeable future. This chart illustrates historical hay stocks. Again, it kind of goes along with the map I showed earlier, and you can see where the 2019 May numbers stacked up, and those were in red. So if you look at the second from the right, blue box, it should be red, but it's blue. We were fairly low. We were as low as we were in 2013 and then again in 2007. If you look at the bar to the right, it represents what the Livestock Marketing Information Center forecasts for hay stocks come May of 2020, which is about the same, maybe a little bit improved over this year. But the point is, if there are producers out there that need forages, usually that means not only will they utilize alfalfa, perennial cool season grasses, but they're also going to look for or look to small grains, summer annuals like sorghum, Sudan grass, pearl millets, all of those types of things to augment their hay supply. So again, it's my opinion that demand for these types of seeds come next year will be strong, will be very strong. So I think we all need to understand that we need to plan accordingly. So if I look at kind of again, kind of painting with a broad brush here, cover crop use is obviously increasing for several reasons we at La Crosse Seed believe. Like I stated earlier, many growers are getting very advanced, and I think Anna hit on this as well, very well, in what they utilize and how they incorporate cover crops into their crop rotations. The industry is working hard. When I say the industry, the cover crop seed industry is working very hard at developing new varieties within a species, or even looking at new species altogether to help not only augment the supply that we have and what we can do to cover a large footprint, but also we're trying to drive innovation so more and more growers can more easily integrate cover crops on their farm. With that said, the most widely used cover crops across the middle of the country continue to be small grains by a huge margin. Planting cereal rye, for example, can be planted later in the fall, which makes it virtually painless for a advanced cover cropper or even a new adopter to try, as most don't have to really change their cropping system or normal farming practice to make that work. You just seed the cover crop after normal crop harvest. And across many areas of the Corn Belt, I think many of the listeners can agree that we'll be reaching black layer in corn about the same time as historical frost dates. So it's probably more likely this year that small grains will be even more widely used. Some of that will be seeded potentially after wheat, obviously, and has been seeded already. But as we go into late summer and early fall, and I get it, we're going to have some later falls in some regions, but that does make it more conducive to plant small grains and other grasses. And it will be a huge percentage for sure, as just about every cover crop acre has some sort of grass or small grain component included on it. No doubt, soil improvement is really important, and protecting our most valuable resource is on the minds of most growers and just folks in the industry. Like Anna again pointed on, there has been a shift where the guys that are more advanced are really looking at varied species, a lot of different varieties, different formulations, different combinations, which again can be a little challenging to predict what guys are going to be looking for. And that's great. However, and Anna hit on this as well, I think short-term benefits actually deserve a little bit more attention. And here's what I'll say. With the current ag economy, growers need maybe a little extra incentive to try new things and adopt new practices. If you can factor in the 1 to 2 year gains, like Anna mentioned, then that adds to value of cover crops in general. And I know the industry, a lot of folks in the industry are working on making those gains and those returns on investment a whole lot more transparent. The challenge we have in our industry is a cropping system or an ag enterprise that is based in Indiana or Kentucky or Iowa or Michigan. Obviously, they're all going to have a little different circumstance, so it's really hard to compare the value of what a guy might be doing and how that might change his return on investment in one part of the country versus another. But I know we're making strides, and I think, again, that's going to be more transparent as we go forward. Those first year gains are a lot of different things. Again, I'm not telling you nothing you haven't heard already, and they're on the bottom of the page there. Again, Anna mentioned those, from erosion to weed suppression to utilizing nutrients better, like we've talked about with forages. All of those circumstances, all of those benefits, there is no doubt that a grower in year one, or maybe year 1 and 2, or however long they use a cover crop for those purposes, they can see a benefit. And I know, as we all know, it takes a long time to change organic matter. It takes a while to change soil structure. Those things are all great, and we're doing that. And some would argue we're doing it quicker than maybe most believed, but it does take time. And I think in the current ag economy, if we can present some real benefits or some real reasons why guys could use a cover crop a little bit quicker, there's no doubt that that will prove beneficial. And remember, other initiatives, some of them are local, some larger, more widespread endeavors, like the hypoxia task force, for instance, they're going to continue to benchmark the gains or the failures we make when it comes to erosion and nutrient runoff. Those evaluations are not going away. And as we get into 2020 and 2025, we'll see what kind of improvement we've made across the country, for sure. So a few things to hit on here. With the prospects of where overall usage could be in 5, 10, 15 years, it's imperative more growers start integrating summer and fall seeded cover crops into their cropping plans earlier than they have before. And I know some are already doing that, but if we're going to advance the adoption of cover crops, we need to get it in the minds of growers that we need to be thinking about cover crops for 2020, meaning a cover crop that you're going to plant in the fall of 2020. We need to be thinking about that today. When we're riding in the combine or when we're doing the things that we normally do this time of year or getting ready to do, we need to be thinking about things a year in advance. I know most growers think about the outlays that they're going to have in their operation several months or if not a year in advance. We need to treat cover crops like any other outlay on the farm. Growers should first identify the goal or benefit they want in their cover crop plantings and realize that in order to attain that benefit, they may need to make a change or two. And sometimes these conversations are tough, especially if you're dealing with growers in the upper Midwest, where obviously the time to plant a cover crop is limited compared to a grower, say, in Arkansas or Tennessee. In order to make an improvement on a current farm, it might take a cover crop that needs to be seeded at the time of the year that doesn't really work in their current cropping rotation. Is that farmer or is that grower going to be willing to augment their crop rotation in such a way to get that to work? And if they can't, it makes it really, really hard. These are plants, they need time, they need growing degree days to get started. Whenever we're up against it in the fall, if we can't get the cover crop to establish properly, then it's really goes back to what are we using and what are we doing this for? Perhaps it's changing a crop rotation like I mentioned, or even something as slight as tweaking a corn hybrid or a soybean variety maturity. I know that's not always an easy conversation either. Maybe it's something as simple as harvesting higher moisture grain in the fall to give you more time to not only get the cover crop seeded, but also to get them to reach their full potential as best you can. Again, really appreciate the opportunity to provide a little bit of insight from a seed distributor's standpoint. Really appreciate being on this webinar, and of course I'll stay around to answer any questions that anybody has. So thank you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Scott. Well, now I'd like to enter into a time of Q&A. I know we've started getting some questions already, but if you have a question for Anna or Scott that you haven't asked yet, please go ahead and type it into the chat box now. Or if you have a question that pops up, just go ahead and type it in whenever you feel like it. Okay, so this first question I believe is for Anna, and it says, can we terminate a cover crop in the fall, assuming it has reached 6 to 12 inches and is actively growing, and still achieve the full benefits of a cover crop?
To achieve the full benefits of a cover crop, we really recommend that you let them overwinter. For a large portion of the country, we see most of our erosive rainfall events in that late winter, early spring time frame, that's when we really want the most growth out there. So I would encourage you to wait until spring for termination. If you are concerned about having too much top growth, too much biomass in the field, there are several species that will winter kill, and then you won't have to worry about termination. As we get into the colder parts of the fall, I'm not even sure, you'd have to be careful with the effectiveness of a herbicide, but I think based on your cover crop selection, you can really tailor to what your needs are. And if you're looking for something that you don't have to terminate in the spring, I would really recommend a species that would winter kill in your area.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Anna. Scott, I don't know if you have any other suggestions to that as well, but if you have anything, feel free to jump in on that question as well.
No, Anna's right on the money. I mean, it kind of depends. When we talk about cover crops, we're talking about such a wide range of plants, right? So if you're talking about a grass or a legume, depending on the crop rotation, depending on what cash crop is following that cover crop, all of those are variables that need to be considered. Not to mention, how are you going to terminate, what kind of equipment you have. Those are all things that need to be decided early on as part of the game plan. And like Anna said, some things are probably not going to reach their full potential if you don't let them do their jobs as much as possible and let them overwinter.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Scott, I believe this next question is for you. It touched upon something you brought up a little bit in your presentation, but you mentioned that that the cover crops industry is working on developing new varieties and looking at new species to better cover crops and continue innovating. So this question asks if you could provide any more details on maybe some of the specific traits that new varieties and cover crops are having.
No, it's a great question. So again, if we break cover crops into the different segments, from a grass to a legume to a broadleaf to a brassica, what we're thinking about not only how can we make these cover crops more conducive to use maybe across a wider footprint, how can we make them more simple for guys to use and get started. So when I think about different changes or different varietal differences within or compared to what we're doing now, I'm thinking about, let's talk about legumes. One of the challenges we have with legumes is not only how hardy they are, how much they overwinter, but with many cover crop legumes, one thing has always been they produce a lot of hard seed. And hard seed is something where, you might want a cover crop in one fall, but if the hard seed percentage is high and that cover crop is left to sit out there and it does go to seed, potentially we have a cover crop in for much longer than what we intended. So it stands to reason that, there is work being done in the industry on how can we lower the amount of hard seed in a legume. For example, we're talking about maybe annual ryegrass. How can we, in annual ryegrass, not only make them more winter hardy, because we want them to work all through the winter. How can we, compared to the amount of top growth you have in an annual ryegrass, and maybe an annual ryegrass for a guy that's wanting to use a cover crop in the spring for forage, top growth is really important. But for a row cropper without livestock, maybe he doesn't necessarily want that top growth. Again, recognizing that the more top growth you have in the spring, the more challenging it comes when we're talking about timing and proper termination. Maybe the idea is we want less top growth and we want more root growth. So that would be another thing that folks are working on. When we're talking about small grains, how can they do everything that we want them to do while still being, maybe a little bit more winter hardy at the same time, depending on how quick we get them planted. There's just a whole host of services that we're trying to build in to maybe some of the more common cover crops that we've been using for some time, and they work great. But there's no doubt there are new varieties out there that we think and that folks are working on. Some might be on this on this presentation or listening in. Others might not be, but there's a lot of folks working hard in checking off the boxes on the things that have been a challenge to us to get to this point. If we can eliminate some of those challenges and we can do that with the right variety, then that'll be a win going forward.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Did you want to chime in as well, Anna, on that question?
I just wanted to echo what Scott said and make sure that folks, when you're choosing a cover crop, make sure that you're working with a reputable seed dealer, like someone like Scott, and make sure that you know the variety that you're getting, because there's, like he said, a lot of variability between in one species. And so it's really important to have someone that knows the fine points of those different varieties on your team when you make that decision.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Now, this next question, I'm not sure if either of you have this data, so I'll ask it to both of you. But what is the estimated amount of warm season forage seed that was or will be lowered or lost from Palmer amaranth outbreak this year? And what is projected to be in short supply for 2020 if there was any forage seed lost?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. It's a great question. So I'll try to answer the last part first, if I understand it right. So if we have forage losses compared to what we had in 2019, if we have them again in 2020, we're really going to be behind the eight ball. But even without a tough winter, again, we're still going to be below normal on hay supplies across the country. So anything that guys can typically use, whether we're feeding, lactating dairy animals, beef, goats, sheep, for the horse producers out there, those guys, they're going to be looking for a lot of different forages. Anything that can be fed safely is going to be potentially an option, depending on the kind of winter we have and maybe depending on the spring that we have as well. So I would say that going into next year, I think I would plan on, again, with the fact that so many of our cover crops can be fed, I would go in thinking or assuming that there might be some tighter supplies on some things. Now, I think summer annuals were brought up in relationship to Palmer. And before I get to Palmer, I'll say summer annuals are increasing not only from a cover crop standpoint, but the use of summer annuals in many parts of the country, maybe not all, but in many parts of the country, I feel like guys are getting more comfortable using sorghum Sudans and pearl millets and things like that. Depending on the kind of fall that those growers where that seed is produced, a large percentage of it is produced in Texas. Depending on the kind of fall we have and their harvest, that could fluctuate the amount of seed we have available for next year. I know that was one of the issues in the fall of 2018, is that growers in Texas who were growing sorghum Sudans and some millets and different things, they had a really tough fall. It was a really wet fall, and that impacted the amount of seed supply we had available for this year. As it pertains to Palmer amaranth, I think so. It's been documented that maybe some Palmer amaranth has more of that getting into the Midwest has come through natives and native forbs and wildflowers and things of that nature. So that's probably a different conversation altogether. I do think that with more Palmer showing up and potentially the industry doing what we need to do to make sure that doesn't happen. I know there's been a lot of strides made in testing and DNA testing to eliminate or help ease the mind of growers who might be putting in a pollinator plot or something with native forbs. It kind of depends on where the seed is coming from, right? On maybe if there's a larger risk of Palmer. But again, there's been a lot of work done to make sure that we eliminate as much Palmer as possible. It's still a threat. It's very hard to identify. The seed looks a lot like any pigweed species, but again, I can't say that without saying there's a lot of folks in the industry, in the seed testing industry that have doing a lot of work to make sure that we identify that problem before it gets out to somebody, somebody's ground or farms, and then it becomes a much larger problem.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let's see. Our next question, I don't know who this is directed towards, but is cover crop a good way to deliver biologicals to the soil for the next crop? So I assume that is talking about biological seed treatments, maybe.
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at that one too. Great question. So I know there's several folks that are getting more involved. Obviously, biologicals has a lot of momentum in the overall ag industry, and if there is a way to get some of that technology into what we do with cover crops, I think the whole industry is looking at ways to do that. And there are ways that we could potentially do that moving forward. We just need probably a little bit more. Definitely, when there's opportunities for biologicals to be involved in the conversation on cover crops, I think most people in our industry are listening on how we can get that started. Still have a lot of work to do.
And cover crops in general are just a good way to support soil biological function. So when we have a living root in the ground, that's going to support that soil biology just in general.
Perfect. Thank you both. Now, Scott, this question was directed to you, but I also think Anna will probably have something to say on it. So how big of a role are public incentives playing in growers' decisions to adopt cover crops?
Great question. And I know Anna will have some insight here for sure. I know Anna and I are both involved in some of these discussions, and we have been for several years. So I think in certain areas of the country, state and federal programs have really helped drive adoption. There's no doubt. And I think they will continue to drive the adoption of cover crops and other conservation practices. Depending on state, the state you're talking about, whether that's a couple that come to mind would be, like Iowa and maybe Indiana, they would be able to provide a little bit more information on what percent of the cover crops that are planted actually have a cost share dollar associated with them. But I think going forward, whatever the role of cost share will have, I think it could be argued both ways. In my view, to make cover crops work with some, it might take a little bit of a carrot to get that going. But I think everyone would agree that to make this work and for this whole practice to be sustainable in the future, we're going to have to get farmers, guys and gals, to understand what cover crops can do. And maybe we do that with a little bit of cost share, knowing that I don't think cost share will be an option forever, right? So we got to take these dollars that we have, we've got to make them be as efficient as we can, extend them as much as we can to get as many people covered as we can, and get them educated on what cover crops can do, because I don't think the cost share dollars will be there forever. Go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, I know in the eastern U.S. There are more government programs in place to help encourage adoption. And I was just trying to remember, Indiana has some specific numbers on cover crop acres that are cost share versus not cost share. And I know that the cover crops that are not in a government program outweigh cost share program acres. I wish I could remember those numbers, but it definitely plays a role, and it's kind of a complicated issue to unpack, but we definitely want to help farmers where we can and encourage that adoption.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. I think we have about enough time for one more question. So I wanted to know from both of you, what is the number one question you're asked about cover crops? And how do you try to respond and let people know how exciting cover crops are? And whoever wants to answer first can answer.
I guess I'll take a stab at it. Probably the question I get asked the most is, what is the most popular cover crop? And that would be cereal rye. It's just really versatile. It works well with a late planting date, and so that's why I think it's got a lot of popularity. As far as, my excitement around cover crops and why to encourage them, I think the benefits are just so vast that no matter what benefits or issues you might be looking to help solve on your farm, cover crops can probably play a pretty strong role. Whether that's, forages or some of the more short-term benefits like controlling erosion, or more, a little more innovative outside the box things like, getting a real fine-tuned handle on your nutrient management, or, helping, grow that soil microbiology. There's just so many aspects to cover crops that are beneficial, and there's so much that we have left to learn. We've really just kind of at the tip of the iceberg on all the intricacies and benefits of cover crops. It's really an exciting area to be in.
Yeah, good answer. I would say the number one question that our team gets, because we cover such a broad footprint, in relationship to where the corn belt and the corn and soybean acres are, is how in the world do I make this work? And I think we often get that question from folks maybe that haven't necessarily been involved with reduced or no tillage. Maybe they're fairly traditional in what they've been doing overall for decades, but they're hearing the message and they want to do what's right. Farmers, a large percentage of them, are very good stewards, and they're trying to do everything they can to make everything that they do sustainable for the next generation. And they want to make it work, but a lot of times, given their cropping system, it's really, really hard to integrate anything other than like what Anna mentioned, and that would be a small grain like winter rye. So that's a number one question that we get, and sometimes the answer to the question is again, like I mentioned in the conversation earlier, it can be rather difficult. Sometimes the answer isn't always as well. Just you don't have to change anything you're doing to make this work. Sometimes we do have to tweak what we're doing a little bit, and that change is hard. So it's not necessarily putting the cover crop is the hard part. It is changing what someone has been doing for so long. But I think we're getting there, and I think that brings me to the last part of your question, Alex, is excitement around cover crops. I just really feel like that the grower of tomorrow, and I'm not saying that today's grower isn't this way, but I think more in the future, growers will be looking at everything they can to maximize their return on investment. That's going to be scrutinized. It'll have to be scrutinized as farms get bigger. There's probably less farms, and they're less farms, but the farms are larger. How can we do anything, whether it's a cover crop or a different business enterprise? How can we do that and make it work? And if we do this or this or this, will it present me an opportunity to make more money? And I think the numbers are going to show, they're starting to show more and more that maybe it's not maximizing yield on every acre. Maybe it's making better use of the acres that we can farm. And I think cover crops is an important tool in making sure that farmers recognize, and growers are already recognizing, that It's something that we need to do. We can gain benefit from it. It's going to make their farms more resilient for the future, and it's going to make them more valuable in the future as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Anna. Well, that's all the time we have today. I'd like to thank our speakers, Anna and Scott, one last time for joining us and for providing us all this wonderful information. And we'd like to give a big thank you to everyone in the audience who participated. I hope you found this information of value. Again, a recording of this webinar will be made later today at seedworld.com. Thanks again, and we hope you have a fantastic day. This is Alex Martin of SeedWorld.